So I'm pleased to introduce Sham Careem from Infobip, and he's going to present, I hope, for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation.
Thanks, Tim. My wife always tells me that I speak too loud, so I'm guessing that you guys at the back are okay and you can hear me, right?
What?
So, I would firstly to say to Meph and to Michael, I think this has been an amazing event over the last couple of days. It's really, really fascinating, especially when we think about this merging of the waters, as it were. And I'm here today to talk to you about something that's right at the heart of that merging between the organizational and the people-centric approach. And that's really about Telco as digital identity enablers. So most of us will be aware of the role that Telco have played so far in identity, and we talked about it yesterday a little bit with Fraser. I'll talk about it again briefly this afternoon. But the focus of what I want to talk to you about is how telcos have now a new and different kind of opportunity which can play into digital inclusion, particularly in emerging markets. And so they have this opportunity to both protect their consumer, protect their customer from fraud, but at the same time to provide them, and again, particularly in emerging markets, to provide them with a digital identity which can address some of the challenges that we are seeing with financial inclusion. So the first thing I want to look at briefly, and I'll just go over this briefly because we're all aware of this, I think, but I always find this a really fascinating slide, which is looking at the amount of people that have tried new shopping online behaviors since COVID. And what I find absolutely stunning in this McKinsey research is that you're looking at, in these emerging markets, almost 100% of consumers have tried new online behaviors since the advent of COVID, which is absolutely incredible. But even more importantly, look at the intent to continue here. So what this is talking to is, once COVID and all the restrictions are over, will you continue with these new patterns, with these new behaviors online? And you can see in India, for example, 69 to 78% and so on. So they're very, very high propensity to continue. And that's just backed up again in this slide here, which I'll just skip over very briefly. But basically, everything in grey, light grey and blue is showing a positive intent to continue, i.e. I will do more and I will continue to do more. And the darker the blue, the higher the intent to continue. So in a nutshell, the world has changed, right? The way people address the world, the way people transact, the way people shop, the way people educate, the way people work has fundamentally changed. And mobile is right at the center of this shift online. So what you're looking at here is the percentage of mobile browsing in April 2022 by different regions and countries. So of all browsing worldwide, in April 2022, 58% of it came from mobile devices, okay? If you break that down and look at Asia, that's 66%, Africa's 64%, and then if we break it down even further and look at some individual countries, Gambia, 81%, Burundi, 77%, Indonesia, 69%, India, 76%. Clearly, mobile is right at the heart of everything that's happening in terms of this surge online. And what that means for telcos is another opportunity for them to take a further step away from this scenario of being that dreaded dumb connectivity pipe, right? They want to be more than the connectivity provider. So there's a real opportunity for telcos. But there's no such thing as a free lunch, as we all know, apart from an MEF event, I should say. There's a huge increase in digital transactions, and inevitably that leads to a huge increase in digital fraud. So criminals were also in lockdown. What did that mean? Well, it means that they had to find new ways. Criminals and fraudsters who were doing in-person, face-to-face frauds, pickpocketers. Suddenly they had nothing, they had no way of earning their living. They also went online. So it's not surprising really that we see these numbers here where you see the fraud contribution cost to mobile channels increasing. You see, in general, fraud and identity theft across the world increasing at a rapid rate. And telcos can play a really critical role here, which we'll talk about briefly later. Now, the second part of this equation, if you like, is around digital inclusion. So we know that fraud's a problem. We know that there are more people going online. We know that telcos can help with fraud, but what about digital inclusion? I found this really interesting when I found this piece of research. So of the 7.6 billion people on the earth, only 3.2 billion, less than 50%, have some form of an ID with a digital trail. 3.4 billion people around the earth have some form of ID, some form of regulated, standardized identification, but no digital trail. So how do those people take advantage of what's happening in terms of the shift to online? How do these people get access to the gig economy? How do these people get access to fintech? How do these people get access to M-Health and M-Education? It's very, very difficult because they have no fundamental digital footprint or digital identity. And as we know, governments around the world are starting to look at this, and they're starting to bring in forms of digital identity, but it's going glacially slowly. I've been involved in something in Africa that, and obviously I won't go into the details, but we've been talking about some form of digital identity for the last 5 years, and that's pretty much all we've done. Our view, my view, is that private sector needs to be at the center of this. We have to find an economic model for private sector to get involved in this because they have the capability to solve this problem. So telcos are perfectly positioned to solve this problem of digital inclusion. Firstly, they have unbelievable reach, as we know. They have unprecedented reach to consumers, particularly in emerging markets. So you think that banking doesn't have the same level of penetration, even government in some cases doesn't have the same level of penetration as a telco does. There is a very strong trust already in place between telco and the consumer. There's a lot of information out there showing that telcos' trust levels are second only to banks. And they're already working with the consumer and with the enterprise, right? So in terms of providing an identity that the consumer can leverage with the enterprise, they're already working on both sides of the street there. So let's start having a look at one of the pillars here. There's two pillars. One is the data that the telco has on the customer. The other one is how telcos deal with identity at the moment. So starting off with telcos and customer data. Telcos, as we all know, have this incredibly valuable pool of data that's often built up over several years and can be very granular. So to give you an example, very briefly, of some of the different types of data and services that the telco is already providing in different markets. So if we look at EU, there's products like SIM swap, KYC, number verify, and account tenure. So SIM swap gives an indication if a SIM has been swapped within a certain period of time, because fraudsters will often try and implement a SIM swap to take over the telephone accounts. KYC, Know Your Customer, is a product where, as an enterprise, and somebody mentioned this before, but as an enterprise, I can say, I have this customer, his name is Sham Careem, this is his phone number, he claims this is his address, can you verify that that's the address that you have on record? Number verify is basically an alternative to SMS OTP, and tenure allows an enterprise to ask the carrier, how long has this person been a customer of yours? So they are attributes, telco attributes that and data that the telco has on the customer. If you look in other markets like APAC, you see that they are slightly more advanced in their use cases. So a lot of them have credit scoring, where they use a combination of account history as well as personal data to actually create a credit score for a consumer who otherwise wouldn't have a digital trail, right? You can't go to Experian or Equifax and get a credit reference for these people. The telco is really one of the only sources of creditworthiness data that's available. They're also providing things like location, demographics, ARPU, and it can be ARPU, it can be annualized, it can be monthly, and so on. So telcos have an enormous source of great personal data. Just one point, because we talked a lot about privacy, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but this is all consent-based, okay? This is only able to be transmitted outside of the network with the explicit consent of the user, unless it is for anti-fraud purposes, in which case it falls under legitimate interest. So the second pillar to look at here is telcos and customer identity, because we talked about this merging, right? I didn't actually realize that it was this widespread, but all post-pay customers and prepaid customers in 155 countries around the world have to prove their identity to the telco in order to have a mobile telephony account. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it means that the customer has to go into the store and has to provide, pretty much in all cases, documentary evidence of their identity. Passport, driving license, in some cases a birth certificate, sometimes also storing a fingerprint. This is a time-consuming process, especially if you imagine scenarios where you're in remote locations and people have got to travel a long distance in order to go and do this. And it's also a very costly process for the telco. But it does mean that telcos do know their customer. They know their customer's identity. So the question is there a way that we can digitize this collection of customer identity? Because to all intents and purposes, what the telco is doing is they are building an identity. The telco lives in the digital world. Can they take that paper-based identity that they're mandated to do, that they're regulated to do, that they have to do with every single one of their customers, and can they digitize it? And if they can, what does that mean? And how can they use that, A, to generate revenue for themselves, but B, to address financial inclusion and allow their customers access to a free, secure digital identity? And the primary route to that is through biometric enrollment for SIM registration. So I'm not going to go into details about biometrics. We've had some expert speakers up here, some great speakers talking about biometrics, and I think we all understand it, but the idea is that during this mandatory SIM registration process, instead of having to go and take your passport or your driving license into the store, what you're able to do is enroll remotely via your mobile device by taking a picture of your identity document, which includes a digital picture, so whether it's a passport or a driving license, uploading that, and then doing a real-time liveliness check through either a series of photos or through a video, which allows the customer to register their SIM card in real time, remotely, 24/7, okay? What does that mean? Well, suddenly it means the telco has a digital footprint of the customer. They have a digital identity of the customer. They know who the customer is. They have a view of the customer's biometrics, which they can store. And they also have a tremendous amount of other data about the customer. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. So the telco has this information. And by the way, they are now enjoying significant OPEX savings because they're not employing people to stand in retail outlets, basically doing administrative tasks. They have faster time to revenue and more opportunity to cross and upsell directly because they've solidified, if you like, this data. So the solution is digital identity as a service. So the concept is basically let's combine these two pillars that I've talked about. So let's take mobile identity, so all the information that the telco has on the customer through the network, through usage and through everything else. Let's combine it with biometric identity. And hey, what do we have? We have a very strong digital identity, but a super enhanced digital identity, because it's not just saying, yes, I am this person, but it also comes with a whole load of other information that the telco has on the customer. So we combine these two things, we create a digital identity, and then the role of the telco is to manage and safeguard that identity and allow the consumer to use the identity with third parties where they need to provide identity credentials. So what I'm going to do is just take you through the customer journey of this step by step. So what happens is a user registers their SIM card via biometric authentication with the carrier. The carrier creates a digital identity, which is then bounded with the user's facial profile, their phone number, and any network attributes, network information that is available about the customer. So then let's say at some point in the future, that customer, who, by the way, remember, has no digital footprint at the moment. They are disintermediated from the digital world. They have no way of applying for a microloan. They have no way of proving who they are online. They have no way of accessing fintech or e-health or m-education, other than potentially traveling long distances with a piece of paper document. That user now wishes to apply via a third-party provider for a loan, okay? That third-party provider, during the onboarding process, the provider goes over to the mobile operator and says, I have this customer, Sham Careem, and this is his mobile phone number. Can you please verify that this really is Sham Careem? He's a customer of yours. We know that because we've done a check via your API. Can you tell me that this is the guy? And so what happens is in the user session, the customer is transferred over to the operator seamlessly. Think about like an interstitial in a web session. And the user is required to take a selfie or upload a quick video. And what's happening then is the telco is checking that, just like any other biometric onboarding process or biometric authentication. The telco is checking that and saying, yes, Mr. Bank, Mr. Loan Company, I can confirm that the guy who's just taken this video, i.e. the guy who's on the session, on the phone, applying for a loan, is Sham Careem. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because at that stage, I'm not only able, as the telco, to say, hey, I'm providing you with authenticated verification. I can also, at the same time, tell you, yes, this is Sham Careem, and by the way, he's been a customer of mine for 5 years. He's spent an average amount of X, whatever currency it is, per month. His location, generally speaking, his home location is within this radius of a pinpoint, or is in this postcode. His office location is in this postcode, right? So there's a tremendous amount of data that can be carried over in that identity authentication request. So suddenly you have a scenario where this disintermediated user who hasn't had access to financial products and services, or for that matter, to any of the digital services that are available, can leverage their existing relationship with the telco to get access to these products and services. The telco can earn money by providing that data, and the user is able to access all of these new products and services. So for us, it's quite a simplistic model, right? It's not rocket science. But to us, we actually think this can be a game changer in emerging markets. We think there's a tremendous opportunity for telcos. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thanks, Sham. So I suppose the obvious question is, we think of Infobip. Everyone in this room probably knows Infobip. They're an A2P company. So where do you fit into this?
You can't say that anymore, Tim. We've got to talk to you about that.
All right, I need to speak to your corporate communications department and get on message. But,
so
that's the way a lot of people would think about them. Not me.
Question. So yeah, sure. We're a CPaaS company, but we're still heavily involved in A2P SMS. But look, we are moving into the area of mobile identity. Basically, we see ourselves as partners to mobile operators, and what we're looking at is how we can help mobile operators leverage their assets to create value for both them and their consumer, right? And so, mobile identity and what we've just discussed here is a perfect example of where we're looking to extend value add outside core messaging.
And is this a plan, or do you have live partners now?
This is a plan. It's a plan that we are looking to roll out. We are talking to various operators in emerging markets at the moment.
Right.
We're trialing the technology. So we already have biometric capability in place. And yeah, we're having some very interesting discussions with mobile operators. I mean, the thing here to understand is that, as with all things mobile identity, the key is getting collaboration with carriers. This doesn't work if only one carrier in a particular country gets involved, right? Yeah. What we need to do is have a group of carriers together who say, look, we buy into this vision. Yes, we will stand this up together. And then you have critical mass in the market, and that's when you can start bringing on the banks, the fintechs, the governments, and everything else. It's exactly what we've seen already in the UK, for example, with mobile attributes.
Well, some people here will remember Mobile Connect. I think it was Mobile Connect, the GSMA thing.
I may have spent some time at GSMA.
Yeah, well, that didn't work. So why do you think this one will work?
Well, look, I think fundamentally what you need to look at when you're talking to operators and asking them about collaboration is ultimately, what is the financial model, right? What's this going to do in terms of revenue? And I think there's a very, very clear path to revenue here, right? If you look at the cost of onboarding and authentication for banks, fintechs, and so on, it can be very, very high. Yeah. And in this example, what we're talking about is those 3.4 billion people. We're talking about opening an entirely new market. That has huge value for the economy. And therefore, there is a strong willingness and acceptance to pay for that. And so the commercial model is that carriers will charge for access to that data.
That 3.4 billion one was an interesting one, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that was people with an ID but without a digital transaction trail. I would have thought there's a lot of people in the emerging markets who don't have an identity at all. They don't really have a postal address. They may not have a birth certificate or a passport. So what about reaching those people?
That's a tricky one, right? So you're right, and the number is 1 billion, okay? So there's 3.4 billion who have a standardized ID but no digital trail, and then there's another 1 billion that have no ID whatsoever. Now, with our model, if you don't have a standardized identity document, unfortunately, we won't be able to help, because the biometrics requires that standardized document. But we're focusing on those 3.4 billion that do.
When you say they don't have a digital trail, I mean, is that because they don't have a phone with a data connection? They only have a...
Undoubtedly, that will be the case in some of that. But no, primarily it's that they've almost all got a phone. They almost all have a data connection, but they haven't been able to partake in the digital world, for various reasons. One of which, undoubtedly, is the fact that they are simply beyond reach of these companies. How do you identify them? How do you know who your customer is? How are you going to do something with somebody if you cannot validate who they are? And if you think about it in today's world with the digital transformation that's going on, the idea of, okay, I've got a new service provider, I'll just go into the store and prove who my identity is. That doesn't exist anymore. How do you do that with Uber, right? Yeah. How do you do that with a fintech company? You can't. So these people are becoming more and more disintermediated.
So the walkthrough that you provided on there, you can see the incentive for the organisations, as you were talking about credit scoring people and authenticating and identifying them. It takes a fraction of their time and a fraction of the money. But from the user point of view, that first stage when they are doing a facial recognition test and registering their SIM, how do you frame the incentives for them at that point in order to incentivize them to take that step?
Well, I think the incentive's very clear. It's that, first and foremost, you can do this right now. I'm not going to require. So, you know, think about the scenario where if I want to get a new SIM card, I have to go to the store, I have to take my documents with me, I have to prove my identity, and there's no real value, there's no reason for me to have to do that. So if the operator can explain to the consumer, hey, you can do this all remotely, I think right there you've got a big incentive. And secondly, of course, let's be honest about it, it will take an effort from the operators, right? The operators need to educate their base, but there's an incentive for them as well. There's a financial incentive, but there's also a route to market incentive, because in a lot of these cases, if you think about it, digital marketing for an operator in a country where there's mandatory SIM registration, which requires them to go into a store, what's the point of trying to sell them a SIM card online? Why would you do that? Why would you sell them a SIM card online, send it to them in the post, and then tell them, oh, by the way, you now have to go to the store to activate it?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, right? So I think there's a lot of reasons why both the consumer and the operator.
You frame this as an emerging market opportunity. Is that because they're the low-hanging fruit, or because you think it can't really fly in other markets?
I think it's because in emerging markets we can really complete the circle here, right? Because what we're doing is we're giving this opportunity to operators, and by the way, operators are adopting biometric onboarding everywhere. It's not something that's specific to emerging markets, but it's in emerging markets where they can play this role of digital financial inclusion, right? So for us, it's the balance of this thing. It's the fact that you're solving you're saving money for the operator, you're providing them a revenue source, you're helping to fight digital inclusion, and you know you're creating a new opportunity for consumers. So it's ticking so many boxes.
Okay, maybe time for one question if there is one. We'll move on to the next session. Okay. All right, well, Sham, interesting stuff. Good luck with it all, and good luck with Infobip's journey into this new space.
CPaaS.
Yeah, beyond CPaaS. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And